Before we dig too terribly far down into the adjustment layers, I did want to take a second and introduce you to the world of the histogram inside of Photoshop. Now, I know a lot of folks who just get into Photoshop kind of stare blankly at the histogram and have no real idea what it means, and you really can go without paying too much attention to it in Photoshop and still get pretty reasonable results. However, knowing what the histogram is and knowing what it is you're looking at and why it's there can really help you gauge what it is you're trying to do with your image and help you make more intelligent decisions as to how to do things like tonal and color adjustments. So to show the histogram, you have a couple of options. You may see a little icon over here inside your panels area for the histogram. It looks like a little tiny spiky graph thingy. Or you can go over to Window and run down to Histogram, and it'll open up like so. Now by default, the histogram looks fairly simple. It's just a picture of depicting some sort of interesting graph. You'll notice that you can click and drag on it, and you can make little highlights that don't seem to do anything. But what is this really doing? This graph shows you a representation of the various pixels across your image, from the darkest pixels on the left to the lightest pixels on the right, and it graphs out how many pixels correspond to each range. So here you can see we have not that many pixels toward the darker spectrum, but a lot more pixels toward the lighter spectrums. So you see like all these spiky areas over here on the right-hand side of the image. And if you take a look over at the picture, that actually corresponds with this. Now this is the Penguins image, which is included along with the Windows 7 sample images, which you're welcome to use, or you can really use any picture off the internet. Anything you have will probably be just fine. But if you just take a general glance at this picture, you can see that overall it's pretty bright. You've got a lot of whites on the penguins themselves. Of course, the background is extremely intensely white. And that is reflected here in the histogram because the lighter tones have a lot greater activity, higher activity in this graph. Now that's just a really simple way to look at the histogram, and by default, this is probably what it's going to end up looking like, but this is not all the data that there is contained within it. If we go over to the little drop-down menu that corresponds to the panel, you'll notice that we are currently in the compact view. We can switch over to the expanded view, and suddenly the histogram becomes a lot more interesting. Suddenly we have all this data underneath. We have a little source drop-down, which currently is grayed out, but I'll talk about that here in just a second. We also have a much larger view of the histogram itself, so it's a little easier to see what's going on. But the really cool thing is that at the very top we have what channel we want the histogram to listen to. Right now this is listening to R, G, and B simultaneously. It's kind of averaging everything together. So it's giving you an overall representation of the complete color intensity. So how we see just these little low areas right in here, that tells us that there's not all that much by way of the darker spectrums, but it does spike up toward the end, which makes sense because we have all these really dark, very dark areas all around our penguins. They have all these little black areas on them. However, if we grab this channel drop-down, we can switch this over to red, and what this is doing is showing us the intensity of red in all of our pixels, or the intensity of green, or the intensity of blue. So here we can see that toward the high end of things, we've got a lot of blue pixels. And if you take a look at the sky, that makes a lot of sense. We've got a lot of areas where we have some really bright blues, and I mean bright in terms of kind of pale. They're pushing themselves out toward white. But not that many areas where we have a lot of really, really dark blues. Still, pretty nice broad spectrum of blues across the whole thing. We can also gauge luminosity, which is the brightness of the pixels themselves. And we can take a look at all of the colors at the same time, which is, to me, it's prettier than it is practical, only because sometimes you get some color mixing in here, and unless you're really attuned with how those colors mix and the results that you get from it, it can be a little visually overwhelming. So I generally just tend to stick to RGB unless I know that I've got a problematic color cast. So for instance, if I know that the blues in this image are a little heavy, I will take a look just at the blues, and you can see how heavy they get here at the beginning of our histogram. Again, that's toward the lighter tones. Remember, dark to the left and lighter to the right. So I'll leave this on RGB for our discussion just for the time being. Now down from here we have a source drop-down. That's not going to do us any good for the moment, so I'm going to skip it and jump down to this little area of data underneath. First off, we have the mean. This is the average number of, or the average intensity values for whatever channel we happen to have active right now. So you'll notice as I switch to different channels, these numbers update. And again, I'm going to leave this on RGB. So mean is the average intensity value for our RGB. In this case, standard deviation is how far we vary from that mean, either up or down. And then median is going to be the central, kind of the middle value that is found. So because this is a pretty high key image, meaning it's overall pretty bright, then the middle color, or the middle brightness, instead of being something like, what would it be, 127, is actually a little higher. It's been pushed up to 161. We have the total number of pixels in the image. We also have some other information as well. So we have level. Now what level is going to do is give us the intensity underneath the pointer. That's not if we're just clicking around inside the image. That's if we're actually mousing over the histogram. And you can see that updating. The cool thing about it is this is where highlighting comes in handy as well. And I'll get to that here in just 1 second. Count is going to tell us how many pixels we have at a given intensity level along the histogram. So as we go to these little bright areas over here toward the right-hand side where we have a nice spike in the graph, that tells us we have, well, if my mouse quits moving, we have 8,059 pixels at this particular intensity level. And this is in the 95th percentile. So that's kind of a breakdown of the cumulative number of pixels. It gives you an idea of percentage of how many of the pixels are in that range. Now you can drag a selection over the histogram and it'll start giving you a breakdown of all of the pixels selected within that range. So here we're running between levels 138 to 255. The count shows us the number of pixels that are representative in that number. This represents 61.72% of our image. So like if we dragged from the far left and started to come in, as soon as we make it to 50% or close to it, that means that 50% of our image is pretty bright, if you can see, because we haven't even made it halfway across the histogram yet. We're still way over here toward the lighter end of things, and what that's telling us is the greater half of our image is mostly bright. And the cool thing is you can look at your image and see that's exactly where that's coming from. Finally, you have cache level. This is a number that represents how the histogram is being drawn. To keep things nice and snappy in terms of what your histogram is doing, Photoshop makes some approximations of what the histogram should look like. And the higher the cache number, the more approximation is taking place. So if you want your histogram to be highly accurate, then you can click on this little tiny warning sign up here. It says click for histogram with uncached data. So you click on this, and now this is the actual histogram. Most of the time an approximated one will do just fine. And if things are getting slow, then you may end up wanting to leave it at the simplified version. Now, that's a quick breakdown of that. One thing we did not talk about is the source. So let me show you how this works. This is layer dependent. If you only have one layer, then all you really need to see is the entire image. As soon as you start adding other layers, so for instance, if I just grab a blank layer and drop it on, the source dropdown suddenly comes to life, and we can choose the entire image, a selected layer, or the adjustment composite, which is also grayed out. And the reason that's cool is if I throw away layer 1 and I drop down something like a brightness contrast layer, and we kick up the brightness and we pull down the contrast, I can now take a look at just the result of the adjustment composite versus the original image. So there's the original image, and then there's the adjustment composite on top of that. So I can see how my adjustment layer is changing the overall histogram of the image, which is extremely handy. And you can actually watch the histogram shift over as you play with that. So that is a quick rundown of the histogram and what it's for. The big thing to keep in mind is, again, it's just a graphical representation of the number of pixels that you have along the entire spectrum of your image, from the darkest pixels at the left to the lightest pixels at the right. Now, I did not show the all channels view. And really, let me go ahead and get my source just set back to entire image, and I'll go ahead and kill off this adjustment layer. All the all channels view is going to do is show you green, blue, and red all at the same time, which I generally don't do. It just takes up too much real estate space, and I don't find myself often needing to see all of those simultaneous like that, but occasionally it can be kind of handy if you really happen to need it. The other thing I did want to show, as I go ahead and switch back to expanded view, is you can choose to show the channels in color. So now if I switch over to red, those are red, green, those are green, and blue, those are blue. And the neat thing about doing that is it's a lot harder to get confused as to which channel you're looking at. So it may be easier if you're going to be switching between channels to switch that on, just so at a glance you know exactly which pixels you're looking to. Because I'll be the first to admit, every so often if I just get in here and start playing with things and I forget kind of what I'm looking at, I will forget to glance at my channels drop down, and I won't realize which of the histogram channels I'm looking at the moment. So that is the histogram. I hope that has kind of helped alleviate any potential confusion that might have been. That is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.